Taoist origins. The old man at the western gate. A recap from last time. What is hermeneutics? What are some hermeneutical problems? What is the Shin? Why is it important? How do Mencius and Shunzi differ over human nature? How do they differ over the nature of Tien? Part 1. Smashing religious monoliths. Previously, we spoke about the history of the word religion, how it's an invention of Western civilization relatively recently, and how it was imposed on other people during the process of European colonialism. And we've already seen an example of this in the case of Confucianism. Rather than using the indigenous Chinese word, Rujia, the school of the refined or the school of the sages, which implies a porous group of authoritative scholars, Europeans invented this category of Confucianism, which was modeled after the word Christianity. Confucianism, like Christianity, assumes a single human foundational figure is what's most important, not a community like Rujia. And in a certain sense, this is just a minor difference. But the modern notion of religion is very particular. It behaves in certain ways that the term Rujia, school of sages, does not. Most importantly, the word religion usually implies a monolith. A monolith is something that seems to be unified, inflexible, and unchanging. When you're thinking monolithically, you're assuming that something vast and complicated works the same way all the time. It's something like using a stereotype, although unlike stereotypes, thinking in monoliths can be positive, negative, or neutral. A monolith is an all statement, a thought that says or assumes everyone in a huge group of people is the same, as in all Muslims think that, or all atheists are, or Hinduism says. Well, there's next to nothing that all Muslims for all of Islamic history think in common. And the same is true for atheists. Hinduism, a vast number of people over many, many centuries, doesn't say anything, but lots of individual Hindus say things. So we can't even talk about them as a single collective called Hinduism. The problem here is that we cannot talk about a large, complicated, substantial group of people who've been around for centuries and in many, many different settings as if they're all working, thinking, and behaving in the same way. They're not. For a simple example, let's look at an instance of monolithic thinking in regards to Catholicism. It's a simple yes or no question. Do Catholics use artificial birth control, like medications or condoms? Now, if you just looked the question up online or asked someone who knew about Catholicism, do Catholics use artificial birth control? You'd find a simple answer. No, Catholics do not believe in using artificial birth control methods. And if you wanted to, you could even look up the teachings of the Catholic Church, and this would seem to prove that answer correct. Catholics are not supposed to use artificial birth control. That was easy, right? Well, not so fast. According to this 2011 study, 89% of American Catholic women have used some form of artificial birth control. 89%. That's an overwhelming majority of American Catholic women, and they use artificial birth control. And by the way, there are similar numbers in many other countries and amongst Catholic men too, and this study is hardly unique. So, if almost 9 in 10 Catholics use artificial birth control, does that mean that Catholics believe in using it or not? Are all Catholics hypocrites? Are the teachings of the Catholic Church simply out of touch with most Catholics? The answer's not so simple anymore. But why should it be simple? There are over 1 billion Catholics alive in the world, and that's just today. Why should we assume that they all think and behave in the same way? Just because 1 billion different people call themselves the same thing, that doesn't mean they're identical people. Maybe many Catholics know full well what their church thinks about birth control, but they just disagree. Maybe many Catholics know what their church says about artificial birth control, but they think it's just not that important of a teaching. Maybe many Catholics think that the opinions of a small handful of teachers and theologians in some faraway country don't get to define their religion. And maybe many Catholics have no idea what their church thinks about birth control. The point is that Catholicism is not a monolith. It's not just one solid thing that doesn't change, grow, or have internal differences of opinion. And so here is another huge issue when it comes to studying religion. Not only are we usually imposing the category of religion onto people, and therefore possibly miscategorizing what these people actually thought and did, we have to watch out for monolithic thinking, assuming that there is obvious, consistent patterns that apply to everyone in a group. Instead of monoliths, we need to look for complexity and diversity. So rather than just focusing in on Confucius, and assuming falsely that he defines Confucianism, we need to understand that there are whole schools of thinkers, like Mencius, Xunzi, and hundreds of others across centuries, and across many different histories, and in many different cultural contexts in lots of different places. They all had their own personal lives and thoughts on a multitude of subjects, and they all applied their own hermeneutics to texts and teachings, and they most certainly did not all agree with each other. And this isn't just a problem when it comes to Confucianism. This is a problem when talking about any place that does not use the vocabulary of modern European colonialism. Since China has a long history and a huge population, most of which has little or nothing to do with Western thought, we can see how problematic the notion of religion is, and how it falsely makes us think in monoliths. Now, remember how the early Confucianists arose out of the Spring and Autumn period, when the social and political order was particularly chaotic and violent? The world seemed broken, and so people like Confucius, Mencius, and Xunzi tried to create new social orders and political systems. Well, they were hardly the only ones who did this at the time. There were dozens of schools of thought and ritual that arose out of the Spring and Autumn period. Some of these are now labeled Confucianism, but most are not. Other than the fact that they're all from the same vast region of the world that we call China today, there's no one monolith that explains them all. Simply saying Chinese religion doesn't mean anything. Some of these schools of thought have a lot in common. Others are historically unrelated, and still others actively fought with each other. Plus, you could be a member of more than one of these groups at the same time. Or you could have practices and customs that were unique to your own town, or even just your family, and yet you could still say that you belong to some far-flung international school of thought like Rujia. Historical people are individuals, just like today, and so we shouldn't reduce them all down to monoliths. We have to treat ancient China just like our own culture. It's full of diversity and debate, and individual people who behave in unpredictable ways. While it's true that there are many schools of thought that arose in response to the Spring and Autumn period, two have had particular historical force: Confucianism and Taoism. And like the term Confucianism, Taoism is a recent Western word. Note the ism again. It's an invention of modern Europeans. Remember that, because the word Taoism might try and trick you into thinking that we're talking about a monolith. But Taoism is not a monolith. It contains within itself seeming contradictions and deep differences of opinion and practice. Some kinds of Taoism reject other kinds of Taoism. Taoism is sometimes diametrically opposed to Confucianism, and other times it overlaps with it. there are millions of people who could rightfully be called an adherent of both Confucianism and Taoism at the same time. And while we're not going to get there in this class, there are millions of Chinese people across history who we can correctly call religious, who were neither Confucianists nor Taoists. Part 2. Can the Way be named? The origins of Taoism are a bit murkier than Confucianism. While their certain foundational texts and teachers win exactly a distinct body of teachings which we can easily label as Taoism and nothing else, when that appears is kind of debatable. Returning once again to the tumultuous spring and autumn period, we saw thinkers like the Confucianists, and they asked themselves, what should we do? Society and the political order are broken. So how are we to live? Where is the way? The Confucianists responded by turning to Li, the rites and decorum which they believed their ancestors practiced. By ordering themselves with the ancestral way of life, some of the Confucianists thought that they could put themselves in accord with heaven, the dead ancestors, and the whole of the living human race. The world could just be fixed if people would only turn to the right manner of living as a society. People only needed to follow the proper way, the Tao. The school that we now call Taoism agreed that we need to live as necessitated by the Tao, but they strongly disagreed with the Confucianists on what exactly that meant. The Tao, the way, refers to how the world ultimately works. There isn't a single English word that does the trick in translation here. In one sense, it's something like our phrase, the laws of nature, in that the laws of nature aren't anything in the natural world like gravity or organisms, but rather they're that unseen and unsaid principle that stands behind the universe. The Tao is like that. Remember Wu Wei, actionless action? Imagine watching a play full of people. It had scenery and dialogue, and all these things are going to happen on a stage. And the stage itself doesn't do anything active, yet it supports all of the other activities. The Tao is something like that. It allows the world to exist, but you never see it doing anything on its own. Now, so far, the Confucianists and the Taoists are in agreement. Both agree that there's an ultimate reality called the Tao, the way of things. When things are unharmonious, as they were in the spring and autumn period, it could be said that the way was lost. And when the world functioned properly, it could be said that people were following the right way. So, what's the difference between the Taoists and the Confucianists then? The Confucianists were concerned with human activity. How are we supposed to live exactly? Specifically, how are we supposed to live in a society? The early Taoists, as far as we can tell, were much less concerned with the proper ordering of society in the political sense. We should try to live in harmony with the Tao, but the Tao is not what you think. Indeed, it cannot really be thought about at all. Therefore, there's no way to impose it on anyone. Instead, the early Taoists highlighted that the Tao was radically unlike anything else in the physical universe, because the Tao was transcendent. Now, let's stop for a minute and discuss this word, transcendence, as well as its opposite, immanence. Religion scholars use these words, transcendence and immanence, quite a bit, so it would be very helpful to understand them. Transcendence means outside of the limitations of the physical world, something that does not have matter, a body, or a particular location in time and space. Now, this gets tricky because we humans do have those things, matter, bodies, and locations in time and space. We are material beings that exist in material settings. And therefore, our thoughts and languages are only made to express material things. And so, when we talk about transcendence, something that's outside of those limits, we usually just have to use negative versions of material words. So, for example, something transcendent is immaterial, eternal, and infinite. Well, that's just an indirect way of saying that something is not material, not moving through time, and not finite. We actually haven't said what this transcendent something is, only what it's not. And so that's actually one of the most common features of something transcendent. It becomes very difficult to talk about or to think about. The opposite term is immanence, something that's material, tangible, and knowable by the human mind in the normal sense. Say that you're in love with someone who loves you in return. They're going to say and do a lot of things to express love to you, like sending you sappy messages or getting you gifts. These are immanent things that are physical and easy to understand. But they refer to something transcendent, love, which, if you're lucky, will last forever and make itself known to you in infinite little ways. But you'll never see or touch or hear that love head on. Instead, all you're going to have is these little reminders of transcendent love. Right? These immanent boxes of chocolate are going to stand in for transcendent truths about love that you can't express directly in words. See, this is a major question of all kinds of religious thought. What's the relationship between the immanent, the stuff of human knowledge and experience, to the transcendent, the stuff that we cannot detect well or at all? Well, the Taoists had a much more transcendent view of the Tao than the early Confucianists. While the Confucianists argued over which rituals, decorum, manners, and arts best expressed the Tao, the Taoists were arguing over whether people could know the Tao at all. A famous Taoist text called The Way and Its Power, Tao Te Ching, opens with this line, arguing that the Tao is transcendent. The Tao that can be spoken of is not the constant Tao. The name that can be named is not the constant name. The nameless was the beginning of heaven and earth. The named was the mother of the myriad creatures. This is a famously tricky passage, and the reason why it's tricky is because its vision of the Tao is transcendent. It's trying to talk about something that it knows very well you can't talk about. Now, there's a lot going on in the passage, so let's go through it and unpack it. First, there seems to be two different Taos, one that can be spoken about and one that's constant, or we might say eternal. There is an everlasting, constant way of things, but it can't be spoken of. It's outside of our normal speech. That is, it's transcendent. However, there is a way, a Tao, that people talk about, and people apparently confuse that with the eternal Tao, or the transcendent Tao. In other words, there are some people who think they understand the right way to do things, but they're misguided. Their way is not the eternal way. So this text is responding to some kind of debate about what the proper way is. And it's arguing that if you can talk about what you think the right way is, then you're wrong. Now the next bit. The name that can be named is not the constant name. Now what is that? Again, we have an immanent concept of names, meaning things that have words that we can talk about, right? Things that can be labeled. But those names are not constant. They don't refer to things that last forever. Since we only have experience of limited material things, which will all disappear eventually, all of our words, our names, are likewise limited. But this Tao Te Ching here says that there is an eternal, constant name, but it's not like the other names that we use all the time. Then the text says, "The nameless was the beginning of heaven and earth." That is to say, everything that people know about comes from something people don't know about. All the things that we have names for, everything on heaven and earth, comes from something that we don't have a name for, the eternal, constant way, the Tao. And when we try to use words, names, to describe this Tao, the world as we know it comes into view. So, like a mother giving birth to many children, names or words create the many material things that we know about. This is slippery, so here's another passage from the same text, the Tao Te Ching. Maybe it'll help a little bit more. "There is a thing, confusedly formed, born before heaven and earth. Silent and void, it stands alone and does not change. Goes around, but does not weary. It is capable of being the mother of the world. I know not its name, so I style it the Way. I give it the makeshift title, the Great." Again, there is something which exists before and independently of heaven and earth, so it's older than any material thing. And it's confusedly formed, so it doesn't behave like a material thing either. It's silent, so it doesn't tell us what it is, or what it's like, or what it wants. It's void, so it has no contents or internal parts, like physical things do. It stands alone, so it's unique, and it's not comparable to anything else. It does not change, so it's constant, and yet it goes around without getting tired, so it's constantly progressing somehow even though it doesn't change. And then we see this maternal imagery again. It's capable of being the mother of the world. But note that it doesn't have to be the mother of the world. It's simply capable of being the mother of the world. That is, it's independent of this reality. It doesn't have to do or be anything, yet when it does, it gives birth to everything. And then the author speaks directly to us. "I know not its name, so I style it the Way, the Tao." Even this person who is speaking directly to us about the transcendent Tao doesn't know what its proper name is. But for the sake of convenience, he's going to call it the Way, or the Great. He and we are using words, because that's what we need to do. We have to use words. But we also need to know that words are going to fall short of the reality we're trying to describe. This is a very different notion of the Tao than what we saw in the early Confucianists. For them, the Tao was something that people always knew about, ancient customs and arts that only needed to be practiced again properly. But here, the Tao is elusive. It's everywhere around us, but we can't quite point to it with our thoughts or our words. And this transcendent interpretation of the Tao is going to create a very different school of teachers, practitioners, and texts than Confucianism does. Part 3. Lao Tzu in his book. As we mentioned before, the exact moment in history when Taoism as a distinct school of thought came into being is unclear. It was probably a gradual process of moving away from other schools of thought, like Confucianism, until eventually people back interpreted a distinct collection of writings and thoughts called Taoism. And if you look at those passages from the Tao Te Ching that we just looked at, you can tell there was already a discussion about the Tao's relationship to the material world which the author is responding to. However, after Taoism was a self-identified school of thought, stories emerged to provide a narrative of Taoism's origins. Now, the historical factuality of these stories is highly debatable, but whatever the case, they can tell us a lot about where Taoism came from and how many of the early Taoists thought about themselves. The story of Taoist origins revolves around a shadowy figure called Lao Tzu. Now, right away, we can detect a problem. The name Lao Tzu isn't a name at all. It just means the old master, or the wise old man. It clearly was not a given name, but rather a title that later Taoists used to talk about where some wisdom came from. If you heard a certain insightful Taoist teaching and you asked where did it come from, well, it must have come from one of the old wise masters, so perhaps people just started referring to them all collectively. The many unnamed teachers of ancient times were conflated into this quintessential teacher called the Old Master, Lao Tzu. Or maybe there was a single historical man who went by this title, Lao Tzu, wise old man, but in time his given name was lost to us. Note that later historical records are going to claim to give us his various family names, but these are much later stories, and none of those are going to concern us here. As far as we can tell, Lao Tzu is a title, and we don't have this man's proper name, assuming this man existed at all. In the stories, Lao Tzu died around the middle of the 6th century before the Christian calendar. But as we're not sure if he even existed, who knows? Usually, though, he's depicted as an older contemporary of Confucius, with later sources inventing various interactions between the two sages. We're going to look at some of these next time. In his stories, Lao Tzu is a record keeper in the royal court of Zhou. Reading a lot for many years gave people the impression that he was wise, and apparently he had a reputation for it. For some reason, and the stories differ here, Lao Tzu retired from life at court, and he set out on his own due west to live as a hermit. At the western gate of Zhou, a sentry saw Lao Tzu, recognized him as a great sage, and asked him to leave behind his wisdom before departing. At this, Lao Tzu composed the text that we've just met, the book called The Way and Its Power, the Tao Te Ching. By the way, this is not totally inconceivable, as the Tao Te Ching is very short and could easily be covered in just one sitting. Having relayed his teachings, the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu then set off into the west and never returned again. There are later stories, written centuries after the fact, that recount his exploits in faraway lands like India and Mesopotamia, but in the earlier sources, he simply goes west and falls out of history. We can be dismissive of all this, of course. We have a teacher with a dodgy history, whose name is certainly not his name, writing a book which is itself quite mysterious, who then just vanishes from the pages of history without a trace. But there is value in the story, whatever its factuality. The story tells us what the early Taoists thought of themselves. Like the Confucianists, the Taoists believed that there were great sages who taught wisdom. But, unlike the Confucianists, the Taoists were critical of immanent truths. The importance of Lao Tzu is not Lao Tzu himself, but the transcendent reality that he refers to. So it shouldn't surprise us that Lao Tzu is kind of hard to lock onto as a historical figure. Indeed, he ought to be hard to lock onto according to the very book attributed to him. Remember, the name that can be named is not the constant name. If you're looking for the eternal, the thing that's always true, absolute reality, and that has an unknowable name, some old man like Lao Tzu would just be a distraction. In fact, the somewhat demeaning nature of the name Lao Tzu might prove the point. Don't get too bothered by him, he's just some silly old wise man. Now, next time, we're going to look at the implications of this transcendent interpretation of the Tao, and how it created internal diversity in Taoism and other Chinese religions. Meanwhile, Here are some thoughts for class. What does it mean to treat something as a monolith? What is transcendence and eminence? What does it mean to have a transcendent interpretation of the Tao? Who was Lao Tzu? This lecture was based on the following: Living Religions by Mary Pat Fisher in the 9th edition. It came out in 2013. That book doesn't just cover Taoism, but it has a very nice introductory chapter to Taoism, Confucianism. Also, the book simply entitled Taoism by James Miller, 2003, which gives a topical overview of Taoism based on certain categories of thinking rather than strictly a chronological history.